Hannah had always been content with her life. At 32, she enjoyed a stable career, a comfortable home, and a loving marriage. Her husband, Ethan, was frequently away for work, and while she missed him dearly, she had grown accustomed to his long absences. The rhythm of their relationship had been shaped by the ebb and flow of his demanding career, leaving her with extended stretches of solitude in their quiet house on the outskirts of the city. But this time was different. Ethan's latest assignment was the longest yet, over a year away in a remote location with limited contact. As the months passed, Hannah found herself battling an unfamiliar sense of loneliness. The house felt too empty, too quiet, and the weight of isolation pressed heavily on her. One late afternoon, after another day of restless pacing around the house, she made a decision. Perhaps a pet could fill the void Ethan's absence had left. It had been years since she had last had a dog, but the idea of having a loyal companion once again stirred something inside her. The local animal shelter was a short drive away. As she walked through the rows of cages, the sound of barking dogs filled the air, but Hannah's eyes were drawn to one in particular. At the end of the row, a large, imposing Rottweiler sat silently, his muscular frame filling the small space. His coat was sleek and shiny, and his dark eyes seemed to hold an intelligence that made her pause. The name on his kennel read Titan. Unlike the other dogs who barked and jumped excitedly as people passed by, Titan remained calm, his gaze steady on her. There was something in his eyes, something that drew her in despite his intimidating size. A shelter worker noticed her lingering by the cage and approached. "He's a bit of a mystery, this one," the worker said, nodding toward Titan. "Strong and smart, but quiet. He's been here for a while. Most people are too scared of him because of his size." Hannah crouched down, her fingers brushing against the bars of the cage. Titan moved toward her slowly, his nose twitching as he sniffed her hand. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply watched her with that same calm, almost knowing expression. "I'll take him," Hannah found herself saying, the decision coming more easily than she had expected. Later that day, Titan was in her car, his large body filling the back seat as they drove home. The weight of loneliness that had been sitting so heavily on her chest seemed to lift, replaced by a new sense of companionship. As they arrived home, Titan explored the house cautiously, his powerful frame moving gracefully through the rooms. Hannah watched him with a growing sense of relief. She had made the right choice. In the days that followed, Titan settled into the routine of their household with surprising ease. He followed Hannah wherever she went, his constant presence both reassuring and comforting. They took long walks in the nearby park, and she found herself talking to him as though he were a close friend. His quiet nature made him easy to be around, and despite his size, he was gentle, always careful not to knock anything over in the house. Nights were the hardest for Hannah, though. The emptiness of the bed, once shared with Ethan, seemed to amplify her loneliness. It wasn't long before she invited Titan to sleep in the bedroom. At first, he lay on the floor at the foot of the bed, his massive form curled up on a blanket she had placed there for him. But as the nights went by, Titan began to inch closer. Eventually, he climbed onto the bed itself, resting his head beside hers, his warm breath a comforting presence during the cold, silent nights. Hannah didn't mind. In fact, she found it soothing. The steady rise and fall of Titan's chest as he slept next to her made her feel less alone. The bond between them deepened, and soon she couldn't imagine her nights without him. But then, strange things started happening, small, almost imperceptible changes in Titan's behavior that she initially brushed off. He began watching her more closely, his eyes following her every movement with an intensity that made her feel slightly uneasy. Sometimes, she would wake in the middle of the night to find Titan lying directly next to her, his large head resting on her chest. His presence was heavy, almost too close, but Hannah dismissed it as harmless affection. After all, he was her protector, her constant companion in Ethan's absence. The bond between them continued to grow, but beneath the surface, something unspoken lingered. Something Hannah couldn't quite put her finger on. As the weeks passed, Hannah's life began to fall into a comfortable routine with Titan by her side. They spent their days together, Titan a constant presence as she worked from home and went about her daily tasks. The house felt less empty with him around, and she found herself smiling more, even in Ethan's prolonged absence. But as the nights grew longer, something shifted. It started subtly, with strange dreams that Hannah barely remembered upon waking. At first, they were vague and disjointed, images that flitted through her mind like fragments of forgotten memories. She would wake in the early hours of the morning, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't quite explain. Titan would be lying beside her, his large body pressed against hers, his breathing slow and steady. She told herself it was nothing more than a bad dream, perhaps brought on by the stress of missing Ethan. But the dreams persisted, growing darker and more vivid with each passing night. In them, Titan was always present, his dark eyes watching her, his form looming larger than life. Sometimes she dreamt of him standing at the foot of the bed, his gaze locked on her as she lay motionless, unable to move. Other times, he was closer, far too close, his breath hot against her skin. The dreams left her feeling disoriented, as though she had been submerged in a heavy fog that clung to her even after she woke. One night, the dream was different. Hannah found herself in her bedroom, but everything felt off. Distorted, as though she were seeing the room through a warped lens. Titan was there, lying beside her as usual, but his presence felt different, heavier, more oppressive. In the dream, she reached out to push him away, but her limbs felt leaden, as if weighed down by an unseen force. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, and Titan's eyes bore into hers with an intensity that made her skin crawl. When she woke, her body was covered in a sheen of sweat, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Titan was still beside her, his head resting on her chest, his eyes closed in what appeared to be peaceful slumber. But the weight of the dream lingered, clinging to her like a dark shadow. Hannah sat up slowly, careful not to disturb Titan, and tried to steady her breathing. It was just a dream, she told herself, shaking her head as if to rid herself of the lingering unease. Just a dream. But the sense of dread didn't leave her. In the days that followed, she found herself watching Titan more closely. His behavior hadn't changed. He was still the same quiet, loyal companion he had always been. Yet, there was something in the way he watched her now, something in the way his eyes followed her every movement that sent a chill down her spine. The dreams had changed something between them, and though she tried to ignore it, the feeling of being watched, of being constantly observed, grew stronger with each passing day. The nights were the worst. Hannah began dreading bedtime, knowing that the moment she closed her eyes, the nightmares would return. Each one seemed more real than the last, as though the line between dream and reality was blurring. In some dreams, Titan would climb onto the bed, his massive body pressing down on hers, making it difficult to breathe. She would struggle to move, to push him away, but her limbs felt like they were made of stone. His eyes never left hers, and though he didn't make a sound, there was something in his gaze that filled her with a deep, unshakable fear. One particularly harrowing night, Hannah woke to the sensation of weight pressing down on her chest. Her eyes flew open, and for a moment, she thought she was still dreaming. Titan was lying on top of her, his heavy body pinning her to the mattress. His eyes were wide open, staring into hers with that same unsettling intensity. Panic surged through her, and she tried to push him off, but her arms felt weak, as if drained of all strength. With a great effort, she finally managed to shove Titan off her, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she sat up in bed. Titan jumped down from the bed, his head lowered as if he had done something wrong, but there was a lingering sense of unease that Hannah couldn't shake. What had just happened? Was it a dream, or had it been real? Her mind raced with possibilities, but the more she thought about it, the more confused she became. The dreams had become too vivid, too real, and now the lines between what was happening in her sleep and what was happening in real life were beginning to blur. She glanced over at Titan, who was now lying on the floor at the foot of the bed, his eyes closed as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and it was getting worse. The more the dreams haunted her nights, the more Hannah's days blurred into a haze of exhaustion. She began to lose track of time, her energy drained not just by lack of sleep, but by the growing sense of dread that had taken root inside her. Titan's presence, once a source of comfort, now felt suffocating. She found herself hyper-aware of him at all times, whether he was quietly following her from room to room or lying silently at the foot of her bed. His eyes, those deep dark eyes, seemed to track her every move, even when she wasn't looking. As her fatigue grew worse, so did the strange sensations. Hannah often awoke feeling disoriented, her body aching, as though she'd spent the night fighting off something unseen. The moments of waking were the worst. The heavy weight of Titan pressed too closely against her, his breath warm on her skin. It was as if her nightmares were seeping into reality, and the line between the two continued to blur. After another particularly disturbing night, one where she had dreamt of being trapped beneath Titan's enormous form, unable to breathe or move, Hannah decided that something had to change. She could no longer dismiss these events as mere dreams or a figment of her imagination. The gnawing feeling that something much darker was at play wouldn't leave her. She knew she had to get answers. One evening, while sitting alone in her kitchen, a thought struck her: the security cameras. Ethan had installed them months before his departure, thinking they would help her feel safe while she lived alone. She rarely used them. Her neighborhood was quiet, and she never felt the need to check the footage. But now, with everything that had been happening, a sense of unease drove her to find out if the cameras had captured something, anything, that could explain the strange events in her home. With trembling hands, she logged into the security system on her laptop and pulled up the footage from the previous night. The screen filled with grainy images of her bedroom, lit only by the faint glow of a streetlight filtering through the curtains. At first, everything seemed normal. Just her, asleep in bed, and Titan lying near her feet. But as the minutes ticked by, something unsettling began to unfold. In the footage, Hannah saw herself shifting in her sleep, her body restless, as though caught in the throes of one of her nightmares. Titan, who had been lying calmly, suddenly stirred. He stood up, moving closer to her as she lay there, vulnerable in her sleep. The next few seconds of the footage made Hannah's stomach churn. Titan's movements were slow, deliberate. He crawled onto the bed, positioning himself over her, his face inches from hers. His gaze never wavered, his eyes locked on her as though he were studying her every breath. Hannah's heart raced as she continued to watch, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. In the footage, she didn't wake, didn't stir beyond a slight twitch of her hands. But Titan stayed there, looming over her, for what felt like an eternity before eventually settling down beside her again. She quickly scrolled through the footage from previous nights, her dread deepening with each clip she reviewed. It was always the same. Every night, while she lay in a deep sleep, Titan would move toward her, watching her, sometimes even pressing his body against hers in ways that made her skin crawl. A wave of nausea hit her, and she slammed the laptop shut, unable to watch anymore. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them comforting. The dreams weren't just nightmares. They were rooted in something real, something happening in her home, in her bed, every night. And Titan, the dog she had trusted so implicitly, was at the center of it. But what could she do? How could she confront the reality of what was happening? That night, the idea of sleep terrified her. She knew she wouldn't be able to close her eyes without imagining Titan's shadow looming over her, just like in the footage. She couldn't shake the image from her mind, his dark, intense gaze fixed on her as she slept, oblivious to what was unfolding around her. Desperate for answers, Hannah made an appointment with her doctor the next morning. She hadn't been feeling like herself for weeks. Constant fatigue, strange body aches, and the emotional toll of everything that had happened. Maybe there was something wrong with her health, something that could explain these nightmares and the disorienting sensations she woke up with each morning. At the doctor's office, Hannah sat nervously in the examination room, waiting for the results of her tests. When the doctor returned, his expression was unreadable. He sat down across from her, flipping through her file, before finally speaking. "Hannah, we've run a series of tests, and there's something we need to discuss. You're pregnant." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Hannah's mind reeled. Pregnant? But how? Ethan had been away for over a year. The impossibility of the situation crashed down on her all at once, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She stared at the doctor, her vision blurring at the edges, as she tried to process what he had just said. "There must be a mistake," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband, he's been gone for months." The doctor's brow furrowed in concern. "I understand this may be shocking, but the test results are clear. We should run additional tests to ensure everything is progressing as expected." Hannah left the clinic in a daze, her thoughts spinning in a chaotic whirlwind. How could this be happening? The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit, and the more she tried to force them together, the more fractured her mind became. The footage of Titan watching her as she slept, the strange dreams, the feeling of being trapped beneath his weight, all of it swirled around her in a terrifying cyclone of fear and confusion. Back at home, Titan greeted her at the door, his massive form standing like a sentinel in the hallway. For the first time, Hannah recoiled from him, a wave of revulsion washing over her. She couldn't bear to look at him, couldn't bear the thought of what he had been doing while she lay helpless in her sleep. The truth was too horrifying to contemplate, but it was there, staring her in the face. Titan was at the center of everything. The nightmares, the strange sensations, the impossible pregnancy. Somehow, in a way that defied logic, he had violated her trust in the most intimate and horrifying way imaginable. Hannah retreated to her bedroom, locking the door behind her as if it could somehow keep the truth at bay. But there was no escaping it. Every breath she took felt heavy with the weight of what she had discovered. She couldn't stay here, couldn't live in this house with him any longer. But the thought of leaving, of confronting what had happened, paralyzed her with fear. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing closer and closer until she felt like she might scream. Titan's presence filled the house, even when she couldn't see him. His gaze, his touch, she could feel it in every corner, in every shadow. And there was no one to turn to. No one who would understand the depth of her terror, the unimaginable truth that now haunted her every waking moment. The days following the devastating revelation were a blur of confusion, dread, and despair for Hannah. The once peaceful home, which had offered solace and comfort, now felt like a prison. Everywhere she turned, there were memories of Titan, of the bond she had trusted, of the companionship she had come to rely on, now tainted by a sense of betrayal she couldn't escape. The heavy silence that filled the house was suffocating. The quiet presence of the dog she had once loved, now a reminder of something far darker lurking beneath the surface. Hannah's mind spiraled with questions that had no easy answers. How could this have happened? How could she not have seen the signs earlier? The more she thought about it, the more trapped she felt in her own skin. Her days were consumed by dread, and her nights, once filled with disturbing dreams, were now plagued by sleeplessness. She dreaded the very thought of falling asleep, knowing what might come in the dark hours. Titan was still there, of course. He lingered in the house, always close by, his movements more deliberate than ever. His presence, once a source of reassurance, now filled her with a gnawing anxiety. Hannah found herself avoiding him at all costs, keeping her distance as much as possible, locking herself in her room, or sitting in the kitchen for hours, pretending to be preoccupied with trivial tasks just to escape his gaze. But no matter what she did, it felt as if he were always watching her, his dark eyes never leaving her for too long. Her body, too, had begun to betray her. The pregnancy, an impossible reality that had turned her world upside down, was a constant reminder of everything she was now terrified of. Though the doctor had suggested more tests, she had avoided returning to the clinic, too afraid to face the full extent of what was happening inside her. The idea of carrying a child, one born of something so unnatural, so horrifying, was more than she could bear. As the days dragged on, Hannah's mental and physical state deteriorated. She could no longer focus on her work, her mind constantly returning to the footage she had seen, to the truth she had uncovered. Her appetite disappeared, and the exhaustion that had begun weeks earlier now felt bone-deep. Every time she closed her eyes, the memories of Titan's presence loomed in the dark, threatening to pull her back into the nightmares that had once only haunted her sleep. One evening, after hours of pacing the house in a futile attempt to clear her mind, Hannah found herself standing in front of the bedroom door. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Inside, Titan was lying on the floor as he always did. He had become less active in recent days, perhaps sensing the shift in their relationship. But that did nothing to ease the dread that filled her every time she thought of him. With a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped inside. Titan's head lifted slightly as he watched her enter the room. For a moment their eyes met, and Hannah felt a familiar chill run down her spine. There was something in his gaze that unnerved her. Something she couldn't quite name. She couldn't shake the feeling that he knew everything that had happened, everything that she was thinking and feeling. The weight of it all became too much. Hannah collapsed onto the bed, her body trembling as she buried her face in her hands. The tears came quickly, hot and uncontrollable, her sobs racking her chest. She hadn't cried like this since the doctor's appointment. But now, with everything crashing down around her, the dam had finally broken. As she wept, she felt a weight on the bed. She looked up to see Titan climbing up beside her, his large form settling next to hers. For a moment, her heart seized with fear, but he didn't move aggressively. Instead, he rested his head on her lap, his eyes soft, almost apologetic. It was as if he were trying to comfort her, to reach out to her in some way that transcended words or understanding. But Hannah couldn't accept it. Not anymore. "Get away from me," she whispered, her voice hoarse and trembling. She pushed him away, but her arms felt weak, drained of all strength. Titan didn't budge at first, his eyes still locked on hers, as if he were waiting for something. Finally, he backed off, jumping down from the bed and lying at a distance, his gaze never leaving her. That night, sleep didn't come. Hannah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quiet. Titan's presence weighed heavily on her, even from across the room. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside sent her heart racing. She couldn't continue like this. Something had to change. The next morning, Hannah made a decision. She couldn't stay in the house with Titan any longer. The weight of everything that had happened, the dreams, the footage, the pregnancy, it was too much. She needed space, distance from the dog that had once been her closest companion, but had now become a symbol of everything that terrified her. She called the animal shelter that afternoon, the same shelter where she had adopted Titan only months earlier. As the phone rang, Hannah's stomach twisted with guilt, but she knew this was the only way. When the shelter worker answered, Hannah explained the situation in the simplest terms she could manage. She didn't go into detail, just said that she could no longer keep Titan, that her circumstances had changed, and she needed to return him. The shelter worker didn't ask many questions. They were used to these types of calls, after all. Arrangements were made for Hannah to bring Titan in the next day. As she hung up the phone, a wave of relief mixed with sorrow washed over her. It felt like the only solution, but it didn't make the decision any easier. That evening, as she packed up Titan's things, his leash, his bed, his favorite toys, Hannah tried not to think too much about what the next day would bring. Titan watched her quietly from across the room, his tail thumping softly against the floor. There was an unspoken understanding between them, as if he knew this was the end of their time together. But there was no anger in his eyes, only the same calm, quiet presence he had always exuded. When the morning arrived, Hannah loaded Titan into the car, her heart heavy as she drove to the shelter. The short drive felt like an eternity, and though she had rehearsed what she would say when she handed him over, the words felt hollow. She had no way of explaining what had truly happened, no way of putting into words the strange and horrifying bond that had formed between them. The shelter worker met her at the entrance, her expression kind but professional. Hannah handed over Titan's leash, her hands shaking as she did so. Titan followed the worker inside without resistance, his large form disappearing into the building with one last glance back at Hannah. And just like that, he was gone. Hannah sat in the car for a long time after that, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she tried to process the emptiness she now felt. Titan had been a constant in her life for months, and now that he was no longer there, the house, the car, everything felt different, hollow. But there was also a sense of relief, a sense that she could finally begin to distance herself from the nightmares and the impossible truth she had uncovered. As she drove home, the weight on her chest began to lift, little by little. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, But the first step had been taken. She had removed the source of her fear, and now, perhaps, she could begin to rebuild what had been shattered. But even as she returned to the empty house, the shadows of what had happened still lingered, and Hannah knew that the hardest part of her journey was still to come. The days after Titan's departure were eerily quiet. The house, once filled with his heavy presence, now felt unnervingly empty. The silence that Hannah had once found so unbearable in Ethan's absence returned, but now it carried with it a different kind of weight, a heaviness born of guilt, loss, and fear. Despite her decision to let Titan go, the unease that had taken root inside her hadn't disappeared. It clung to her like a shadow, following her from room to room. At first, she told herself that things would get better now that Titan was gone. Without his watchful eyes, without his looming figure beside her, she hoped that the nightmares would stop, that the strange sensations of dread and confusion would fade. But as the nights passed, she realized that the darkness within her wasn't so easily banished. Each evening, she would lie in bed, waiting for the familiar weight of exhaustion to pull her into sleep. But sleep rarely came. When it did, it was fitful, fragmented, haunted by the remnants of memories she had tried so hard to push away. The dreams were still there, even without Titan. They weren't as vivid as before, but the sense of something lurking, something just beyond her reach, remained. It was the pregnancy that weighed on her most heavily. The thought of it consumed her every waking moment, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape it. She knew she couldn't ignore it forever. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. "You're pregnant." The very idea still felt impossible, unreal, yet the evidence was undeniable. Something had happened, something she couldn't explain. For days she avoided returning to the clinic, too afraid of what further tests might reveal. But as time passed, her body began to remind her of the reality she was carrying. Subtle changes, an ache here, a wave of nausea there, served as constant reminders of the life growing inside her. She couldn't hide from it any longer. One morning, as she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, Hannah stared at her reflection. Her skin looked paler than usual, dark circles had formed under her eyes, and she felt drained, both physically and emotionally. The image staring back at her was one of someone who had been through too much in too short a time. She felt broken, frayed at the edges, and unsure of how to move forward. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach, where the faintest hint of a swell had begun to show. She hadn't been able to bring herself to fully acknowledge it before, but now, as she stood alone in the quiet of the bathroom, she couldn't deny it any longer. Tears welled up in her eyes as a flood of emotions washed over her: grief, confusion, fear. She wasn't ready for this. Not after everything that had happened. She knew she needed answers, needed to understand what was happening to her body, but the thought of facing the truth terrified her. What if this pregnancy wasn't normal? What if the child she was carrying wasn't what she expected? The questions churned in her mind, feeding the anxiety that had already consumed her. Hannah made the decision to return to the doctor. She couldn't live in this state of uncertainty any longer. She scheduled the appointment and prepared herself for whatever news might come. The hours leading up to the visit passed in a fog of anxious anticipation, her mind unable to settle on anything other than the unknown future. When she arrived at the clinic, the sterile scent of antiseptic and the cold lighting did nothing to ease her nerves. She sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to steady her breathing as her heart raced. The minutes felt like hours, and when the nurse finally called her name, Hannah's legs felt like lead as she followed her into the examination room. The doctor greeted her with a gentle smile, though his expression was tinged with concern. He asked her about her symptoms, about how she had been feeling, and Hannah found herself struggling to put her emotions into words. How could she explain the fear, the confusion, the sense that something was terribly wrong without sounding hysterical? After a brief examination, the doctor ordered an ultrasound to assess the pregnancy. As Hannah lay on the examination table, staring up at the ceiling, the cool gel spread across her abdomen, she tried to focus on anything other than the weight of dread pressing down on her. The machine beeped softly as the doctor moved the ultrasound wand across her stomach, and for a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of her own heartbeat thudding in her ears. And then, the doctor's expression changed. He paused, his brow furrowing as he looked at the screen. Hannah's heart skipped a beat as she watched him closely, her breath catching in her throat. Something was wrong. She could feel it. "I'm afraid," the doctor began, his voice careful, measured. "There's no heartbeat." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. Hannah's world seemed to tilt on its axis as the full weight of what he was saying sank in. No heartbeat. The pregnancy wasn't viable. Her body went numb as the doctor continued to speak, explaining the details of what had happened, but his words became a distant hum in the background. The room felt too bright, too cold, and all she could focus on was the crushing sense of loss that had suddenly enveloped her. The tears came quickly, streaming down her cheeks as she tried to process what she had just heard. The baby was gone. The pregnancy that had been so impossible, so terrifying, had ended before it had even begun. And now, she was left with nothing but emptiness. The doctor explained her options, how they could proceed from here. But Hannah barely heard him. She nodded numbly, her mind unable to keep up with the whirlwind of emotions tearing through her. Grief, relief, guilt, it all mixed together in a confusing, painful swirl. When she left the clinic, the world outside felt alien. The sky was a bright, clear blue, and the warm sunlight seemed out of place in the midst of her emotional storm. Hannah drove home in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as she tried to hold herself together. But the moment she stepped inside her house, the weight of everything crashed down on her all at once. She sank to the floor in the middle of the living room, her body trembling with sobs that she could no longer contain. The grief overwhelmed her, and she wept for the baby she had lost, for the strange and terrifying circumstances that had brought her to this moment, and for the life she had once known that now seemed so far away. The house, empty and silent, offered no comfort. Titan was gone, Ethan was thousands of miles away, and now, even the pregnancy, something she hadn't wanted but had been forced to confront, was gone too. She had never felt more alone in her life. For hours she stayed there, curled up on the floor, letting the tears come and go in waves. Her body ached with the weight of loss, both physical and emotional. When the sobs finally subsided, she was left feeling hollow, drained of all energy. The grief stayed with her in the days that followed, but something else began to creep in as well. An unexpected sense of clarity. With the loss of the pregnancy, the weight that had been pressing down on her for so long seemed to lift, if only slightly. She still didn't understand everything that had happened, but there was a strange sense of closure in knowing that the ordeal had come to an end. Hannah wasn't sure what the future held for her, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a small glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she could begin to heal. It was a scorching summer afternoon in New York City, and Olivia felt the heat radiating from the pavement as she approached the high-end fitness center. The air was thick and humid, sticking to her skin like a second layer. As she pushed open the glass doors of the gym, a rush of cool, conditioned air greeted her, offering a temporary relief from the sweltering weather outside. The scent of sweat and disinfectant filled her nose, while the rhythmic thud of weights hitting the ground and the energetic beats of pop music echoed throughout the space. Olivia was here for a fresh start. After a long-term relationship had recently ended, she found herself seeking solace in the physical demands of exercise. Her mind craved distraction, and her body, which had grown lethargic from months of emotional turmoil, longed to be pushed to its limits. Today was her first session with the new personal trainers, and she hoped it would be the beginning of something different, something to take her mind off everything else. The gym was spacious, with high ceilings and large windows that let in beams of sunlight. The light danced on the polished wooden floors, reflecting off the shiny metallic equipment, creating an almost surreal atmosphere. In the distance, she noticed two men standing near the squat racks, their muscular figures immediately catching her attention. Both were tall and well-built, with dark skin that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. They moved with an effortless confidence, commanding the space around them as if it were their domain. Olivia's heart skipped a beat as she realized these were her trainers, Derek and Jamal, Derek was the first to approach her. He had a broad smile that revealed perfect white teeth, and his deep voice was as smooth as velvet. "Olivia, right? I'm Derek," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, but not overly so, and she could feel the warmth of his skin against hers for just a second longer than necessary. Jamal stood slightly behind, offering a nod of acknowledgement. His demeanor was more reserved than Derek's, but there was something about the quiet intensity in his eyes that made her stomach flutter. "I'm Jamal," he said, his voice lower, softer, but just as captivating. "Nice to meet you both," Olivia managed to say, her throat suddenly dry. The three of them stood in the middle of the gym, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow. She was acutely aware of the subtle tension that had already formed between them, like an unspoken current of electricity. The first session was focused on assessing her strength and endurance. As they led her through a series of exercises, Olivia found herself hyper-aware of their presence. Every time Derek or Jamal adjusted her form, the brief contact sent a jolt of sensation through her. Derek's touch was more direct, his large hands guiding her with purpose. When he placed his hand on her lower back to help her straighten her posture during a deadlift, she felt a surge of warmth spread through her entire body. Jamal, on the other hand, was gentler, almost cautious, as though he were holding back. When he showed her how to grip the barbell correctly, his fingers brushed against hers lightly, and she couldn't help but glance up at him. His eyes met hers, and for a moment they simply held each other's gaze. There was no need for words. The connection was instant, palpable. The session continued like this, a delicate balance of professionalism and something more, something unspoken but impossible to ignore. As the hour went on, Olivia felt her body growing tired, but her mind was alert, fully aware of every interaction between them. There was a dance of energy between the three of them, a rhythm that they all seemed to understand without needing to discuss it. When the session finally ended, Olivia was exhausted, but exhilarated. She wiped the sweat from her brow with a towel and caught her breath as Derek handed her a bottle of water. "You did great today," he said, his voice laced with genuine admiration. "We'll push a little harder next time." She smiled, feeling a rush of pride. "Thanks, I needed that." Jamal, standing nearby, added, "You'll notice the difference soon enough. Just stay consistent." Olivia nodded, but her thoughts were already drifting to the undercurrent of tension that had built up throughout the session. There was something between them, between her and both men, that she couldn't quite define. But it was there, simmering beneath the surface. As she left the gym that day, Olivia's mind was a whirl of thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just begun, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. The way Derek's eyes lingered on her a moment too long, the way Jamal's quiet presence seemed to pull her in, it all felt like the start of something dangerous, something exciting. The following week, Olivia returned to the gym, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew she was drawn to both Derek and Jamal in ways she hadn't anticipated. As she stepped inside, she spotted them again, waiting for her. Today, the gym was quieter, with fewer people around, which only added to the intensity of the situation. They began the session as usual, but today, the interactions felt different, more charged. Derek's instructions were sharp and focused, his hands on her more often than before, adjusting her stance, guiding her movements. Jamal watched from a distance, his expression unreadable, but Olivia could feel his eyes on her, following her every move. At one point, while demonstrating a new exercise, Derek stepped behind her, his chest brushing lightly against her back as he helped her lift the barbell. His breath was hot against her ear as he spoke. "Keep your core tight. You've got this." Olivia's pulse quickened, and she nodded, trying to focus on the task at hand. But it was impossible to ignore the way her body reacted to his proximity, the warmth of his skin, the strength in his hands. She could feel the tension building between them, thickening the air around them. Just as she was about to lower the bar, Jamal stepped in, taking the weight from her hands with surprising ease. "Don't overdo it," he said, his tone soft but firm. He was closer now, and Olivia could see the hint of something in his eyes. Was it jealousy? Or was it something else entirely? The two men exchanged a brief glance, and in that moment, Olivia realized that the tension wasn't just between her and them, it was between Derek and Jamal as well. There was a silent competition, a rivalry that she hadn't noticed before but could now feel growing. As the session drew to a close, Olivia felt the weight of what had just transpired hanging in the air. The way Derek had looked at her, the way Jamal had intervened, it was all too much, too intense. And yet she knew she couldn't stay away. There was something pulling her back. Something irresistible about the way both men had ignited feelings inside her that she hadn't felt in a long time. As she gathered her things to leave, Derek caught her arm gently. "Same time next week?" he asked, his voice low and filled with an edge she hadn't heard before. Olivia nodded, her heart racing. "Yes, I'll be here." Jamal gave her a small smile as she turned to leave, his eyes lingering on her as if he were trying to read her mind, trying to figure out where all of this was headed. As Olivia walked out of the gym, the cool evening air hit her skin, but it did nothing to calm the fire that had been lit inside her. She knew, without a doubt, that the story between her and these two men was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The late afternoon sun blazed relentlessly over New York City, casting a golden hue that seemed to cling to the concrete buildings. Olivia's skin tingled under the oppressive heat as she approached the fitness center, its sleek glass facade gleaming under the sunlight. The cool air hit her like a soft wave as she stepped inside, a welcome contrast to the heat outside. The scent of eucalyptus and sweat greeted her nose, mingling with the rhythmic beats of music that pulsed from the gym's speakers. This wasn't just another day at the gym for Olivia. It marked the beginning of something she couldn't quite define, but it felt important. She'd recently ended a long-term relationship, one that had drained her emotionally and left her yearning for a fresh start. Today, she would meet her new trainers. Two men whose names she had only heard in passing, but who had garnered quite a reputation for their expertise and intensity. The thought of working with them filled her with equal parts excitement and nervous anticipation. The gym was expansive, with high ceilings and large windows that let in the fading light of the day. Shadows danced on the polished hardwood floors, giving the space a surreal quality. The weight machines lined one side of the room, while the free weights area was occupied by a few dedicated athletes, their grunts of effort mixing with the sound of clanging metal. Olivia felt her heart rate quicken, though it wasn't from the workout ahead. Her eyes landed on two men standing near the squat racks, Derek and Jamal. Even from a distance, they commanded attention. Both were tall, their bodies sculpted from years of dedication to their craft. Their dark skin gleamed under the gym lights, muscles rippling with each movement as they discussed something in low voices. Olivia swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their presence before they even noticed her. As she made her way across the gym, Derek was the first to turn toward her. His smile was warm but charged with an energy that made her stomach flutter. His broad shoulders and confident posture exuded authority. "Olivia, right?" he asked, extending his hand. His voice was deep, the kind that resonated in her chest. When their hands touched, she was acutely aware of the firmness of his grip, the warmth of his skin against hers. "Yeah, that's me," she replied, her voice slightly breathless, though she tried to mask it. Jamal stepped forward next, his approach quieter but no less commanding. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a split second the world seemed to shrink. There was something in the way he looked at her. Calm, steady, but with an undercurrent of intensity that set her pulse racing. He offered a small smile, a contrast to Derek's more open expression, but it was just as captivating. "Nice to meet you, Olivia. I'm Jamal." She nodded, feeling suddenly self-conscious under their combined gazes. The air between them seemed to thicken, an unspoken tension weaving its way into the space. Olivia quickly diverted her eyes, feeling a rush of heat that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Ready to get started?" Derek asked, breaking the silence but not the intensity that lingered. The session began in earnest, with both men alternating between guiding her through various exercises and assessing her form. Derek was direct and firm, his hands often on her as he corrected her posture, pushing her to go beyond her limits. He stood close, his body heat mixing with hers, every touch sending a small jolt through her. When he placed his hand on her lower back to guide her through a deadlift, Olivia felt a shiver run down her spine. His touch lingered just long enough to be noticed, but not long enough to be inappropriate. Jamal, on the other hand, was more reserved in his approach. He watched her carefully, his presence quieter but equally powerful. When it was his turn to correct her form, his touch was softer, almost as if he was testing her reaction. He didn't need to say much. His eyes spoke volumes, every glance loaded with something unspoken. When his fingers brushed against hers as he helped her adjust her grip on the barbell, it was a feather-light touch, but it made her breath catch in her throat. The gym around them seemed to fade as Olivia became more aware of her body, of the way it moved, the way it responded to their instructions, and most of all, the way it reacted to their presence. Each exercise, each correction, each brush of their hands felt charged with something more than just professional guidance. There was a current of energy that hummed between them, subtle but undeniable. As the session progressed, Olivia found herself caught in the interplay between the two men. Derek's intensity was magnetic, drawing her in with his commanding presence and sharp focus. Jamal's quieter demeanor provided a contrast that was equally compelling, a calm strength that made her want to know more about the man behind the stoic expression. She felt pulled in two directions, her attention divided between them in a way that was both exhilarating and confusing. At one point, while demonstrating a squat, Derek stepped behind her to adjust her stance. His hands on her hips were firm, his chest brushing against her back as he leaned in to whisper instructions. "Keep your weight centered. You've got this," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. Olivia's pulse quickened, her skin tingling where he touched her. But before she could fully process the moment, Jamal was there, taking over with a soft but steady touch on her shoulder. "Don't push too hard too soon," he said, his voice a calming counterpoint to Derek's intensity. His fingers lingered on her skin for just a moment longer than necessary, and when she looked up at him, their eyes met in a silent exchange that sent a shiver down her spine. The tension between the three of them was palpable, a delicate dance of attraction that neither of them acknowledged, but all felt. As they continued through the workout, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the edge of something dangerous, exciting, and undeniably real. When the session finally ended, Olivia was both exhausted and exhilarated. She wiped the sweat from her forehead, her breathing still labored, and accepted the bottle of water that Jamal offered her. "You did great today," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Thanks," she replied, her heart still racing, though she wasn't sure if it was from the workout or the intensity of the session itself. Derek leaned against a nearby weight rack, watching her with a small, knowing smile. "Same time next week?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her stomach flip. Olivia nodded, feeling the weight of their attention on her as she gathered her things. "Yeah, I'll be here." As she turned to leave, she felt both men's eyes on her, a silent acknowledgement of the tension that had built between them. It was an unspoken understanding that something had shifted, that this was no longer just about a workout. There was more at play here, something deeper, something that Olivia wasn't sure she was ready to confront yet, but she knew she couldn't stay away. The walk home felt surreal, her mind replaying every moment, every touch, every glance. The city streets were alive with the usual hustle and bustle, but Olivia felt disconnected from it all, lost in her thoughts. The heat of the day had dissipated, but the heat between her and Derek, between her and Jamal, still burned brightly in her mind. She wasn't sure where this would lead, but one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. Olivia found herself walking into the gym the next week with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. The cool air inside barely soothed the heat that seemed to simmer beneath her skin, a heat she couldn't explain away. She felt it the moment she stepped through the doors, an invisible current that pulsed between her and her trainers. The last session had left her with more questions than answers. Both Derek and Jamal had a way of commanding her attention, of drawing her into their orbit, and she wasn't sure how to handle it. The gym, as always, was alive with activity. The clang of weights, the hum of treadmills, and the steady rhythm of music playing through the speakers provided the usual backdrop. But today, Olivia was acutely aware of everything. How the sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting long shadows across the floor. How the slight scent of sweat mixed with the clean, sharp scent of cleaning products. Every sound seemed heightened, every movement amplified as she made her way to where Derek and Jamal stood, waiting for her. Derek greeted her with that familiar smile, the one that sent a jolt of warmth through her. "Ready for round 2?" he asked, his voice casual, but his eyes held something deeper, something that made her breath catch in her throat. Jamal, standing slightly behind Derek, offered her a nod, his expression unreadable. He didn't say much, but there was a quiet intensity in the way he looked at her that made Olivia feel as though he was seeing right through her, peeling back her layers. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. "Let's get started," Olivia said, trying to keep her voice steady, though her heart was already racing. The session began with a warm-up, the usual stretches and light cardio, but it didn't take long for the familiar tension to re-emerge. Derek, as always, was hands-on, his touch firm and confident as he guided her through each exercise. His proximity was intoxicating, the way he moved close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with sweat. Every time his fingers grazed her skin, it felt like a spark, igniting something deep inside her. Jamal, in contrast, remained more distant, but his presence was just as powerful. His eyes were constantly on her, following her movements, assessing her progress. When he spoke, it was in short, clipped sentences, direct, efficient, but there was a warmth in his tone that betrayed the seriousness of his demeanor. He was like the calm before the storm, always watching, always waiting. As the session wore on, Olivia found herself caught between the two men, the intensity of the moment building with every minute. Derek pushed her hard, encouraging her to lift heavier, move faster, but there was always that underlying layer of something more. Something that went beyond the workout. Each touch, each word carried weight, and Olivia could feel herself responding in ways she hadn't anticipated. At one point, Derek moved behind her, helping her with a particularly challenging set of squats. His hands gripped her hips firmly, guiding her through the motion. "Keep your back straight, push through your heels," he instructed, his voice low and smooth, sending a shiver down her spine. Olivia nodded, her breath catching as she followed his lead. But it wasn't just the physical exertion that made her heart race, it was the feeling of his hands on her, the way he leaned in just enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath against her neck. For a brief moment, it felt like the entire gym faded away, and it was just the two of them, locked in a private moment of tension and anticipation. But then, as if sensing the shift, Jamal stepped in. "Let's switch it up," he said, his voice cutting through the moment like a knife. He took the weights from Olivia's hands, his touch firm but gentle, a stark contrast to Derek's more forceful approach. "You're doing great, but don't push too hard. We don't want any injuries." His eyes met hers, and in that moment, Olivia saw something she hadn't expected. Something like jealousy flickering beneath the surface. It was subtle, barely there, but enough to make her wonder if Jamal had noticed the unspoken connection between her and Derek. And if he had, what did that mean? The rest of the session continued in much the same way. Derek pushing her to her limits, Jamal pulling her back just enough to keep her grounded. It was like a dance, the two men balancing each other out, each of them playing their part in a dynamic that was as thrilling as it was confusing. By the time the session ended, Olivia was drenched in sweat, her muscles aching from the intensity of the workout. But it wasn't just her body that felt exhausted. Her mind was spinning, her emotions a tangled mess of confusion and desire. She grabbed her water bottle, taking a long sip as she tried to steady her breath. "Good work today," Derek said, his voice filled with approval as he handed her a towel. His eyes lingered on her, and for a moment it felt like the world around them had disappeared, leaving just the two of them standing there, the weight of their unspoken connection hanging in the air. "Yeah, you're improving quickly," Jamal added, stepping in with his usual quiet presence. There was a softness in his voice that contrasted with Derek's bold energy, but it carried its own kind of intensity. Olivia managed to smile, though her thoughts were already swirling. "Thanks, both of you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The tension between them was palpable, like a tightly wound string that was just waiting to snap. As she turned to leave, she could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their gazes sending a shiver down her spine. She didn't look back, but she knew that something was shifting between them, something that went beyond mere physical attraction. There was a tension that was building, and it was only a matter of time before it reached its breaking point. The following week, Olivia arrived at the gym with her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what to expect, but the lingering tension from the previous sessions was impossible to ignore. As she entered, she immediately noticed Derek and Jamal waiting for her near the free weights section, their expressions unreadable, but their presence undeniable. Today, the gym was quieter than usual, with only a handful of people working out in the background. The sunlight filtering through the windows bathed the room in a soft glow, casting long shadows on the floor. There was an almost dreamlike quality to the atmosphere, and Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. The session started as it usually did, with Derek leading her through a series of intense exercises, his hands on her more often than not as he corrected her form. But today, there was an added edge to his touch, a lingering warmth in the way his fingers grazed her skin. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Olivia felt it, felt the heat building between them with every passing second. Jamal, as always, was more reserved, but there was a quiet intensity to the way he watched her, his eyes following her every move. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words were measured, deliberate. There was something about his presence that made Olivia feel grounded, even as the tension between her and Derek continued to simmer just beneath the surface. Halfway through the session, Derek suggested they move to the boxing area for some light sparring. Olivia hesitated, but before she could respond, Jamal was there, handing her a pair of gloves. "It's good for balance and coordination," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "You'll do fine." The boxing area was quieter, more secluded, with padded floors and punching bags hanging from the ceiling. Olivia slipped on the gloves, feeling the weight of them in her hands as she faced Derek. He grinned at her, his eyes gleaming with challenge. "Let's see what you've got," he said, his voice teasing, but filled with a competitive edge. They began sparring, Derek holding the pads as Olivia threw punches. At first, it was light, playful even, but soon the intensity ramped up. Derek pushed her harder, his instructions coming faster, his encouragement turning into something more like a challenge. Olivia felt her adrenaline spike as she responded to his commands, her punches landing with more force, more precision. But then, just as she was getting into the rhythm, Jamal stepped in. "Take it easy," he said, his voice cutting through the moment. "You don't need to prove anything." Derek shot him a look, but Jamal remained calm, his eyes on Olivia. There was something in his gaze that made her pause, something that spoke of a deeper understanding, a connection that went beyond the physical. The tension between the two men was unmistakable now, and Olivia could feel herself caught in the middle of it. She lowered her gloves, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts as she looked between them. "Maybe we should call it for today," Olivia suggested, her voice shaky but firm. She needed time to process what was happening, to understand the dynamic that was unfolding between them. Derek nodded, his expression unreadable, while Jamal simply gave her a small, understanding smile. As Olivia left the gym that day, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something, a precipice that, once crossed, would change everything. The days passed by in a blur, and before Olivia knew it, she was back at the gym. Her anticipation had shifted from a subtle undercurrent to a tangible pulse in her veins. The interactions with Derek and Jamal had left her on edge, and the tension between them had grown thicker with each session. Today, however, felt different. It was as if an invisible threshold had been crossed, and she could no longer pretend that their connection was purely professional. When Olivia walked into the gym, the familiar sounds greeted her, the metallic clank of weights being lifted, the soft thud of feet hitting treadmills, and the low hum of conversation. But her focus was entirely on the two men waiting for her. Derek and Jamal stood near the far wall, their silhouettes outlined against the floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the fading light of the afternoon. The golden rays bathed the room in a warm glow, casting long shadows across the polished floors. She approached them, her heartbeat quickening with every step. Derek gave her his signature smile, the one that always sent a jolt of heat through her, while Jamal's eyes were as steady and unreadable as ever. There was something simmering in the air, a tension that felt more alive than before, and Olivia could sense that today's session was going to be different. "Hey, ready for another challenge?" Derek's voice was casual, but the glint in his eyes betrayed something deeper, something more personal. "Always," Olivia replied, trying to keep her voice steady, but the truth was, she wasn't sure she was ready. Not for what she felt simmering beneath the surface. Jamal stood close by, his presence quiet but powerful. His gaze lingered on her for a moment before he spoke. "We're going to push you harder today. You've made a lot of progress." The session started like any other. Warm-ups, stretches, and the familiar rhythm of weightlifting. But there was an unspoken understanding between them now. Something that had been building for weeks, but had finally come to a head. Every touch, every word, every glance felt charged with meaning. Derek's hands on her waist as he adjusted her stance during squats, Jamal's quiet encouragement as he stood nearby, watching her with those deep, dark eyes. It all felt like more than just a workout. As the session progressed, Olivia found herself caught in the middle of their silent competition once again. Derek was relentless, pushing her to lift heavier, move faster, reach higher. His hands were on her constantly, guiding her, correcting her form. But there was something else there, too. Something possessive in the way his fingers lingered on her skin, in the way his voice lowered when he spoke to her. "Focus," he said, as she gripped the barbell, his hand brushing against hers as he helped her position it correctly. "You've got this." His touch was electric, sending a surge of energy through her body. Olivia's breath hitched, but she nodded, determined to keep her composure. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, not just from the physical exertion but from the growing awareness of Derek's proximity, his presence overwhelming her senses. Jamal watched from the sidelines, his expression calm, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. When it was his turn to step in, his approach was different. He didn't need to say much. His quiet authority was enough to ground her, to keep her focused. His touch was gentle but firm, a contrast to Derek's intensity, and Olivia found herself drawn to the steadiness he provided. "You're doing great," Jamal said, his voice low and steady as he adjusted her position during a set of lunges. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. The connection was instant, unspoken but undeniable. As the session continued, the tension between them grew, thickening the air around them like a fog. Olivia could feel it in every glance, every touch, every word that passed between them. The dynamic between her and her two trainers had shifted from one of mere attraction to something deeper, more complex. She was no longer just their client. They were all caught in the same web of emotions, and it was only a matter of time before it came to a head. The turning point came when Derek suggested they move to the mat area for some core work. Olivia complied, lying down on the soft mats as Derek stood over her, his gaze intense. Jamal remained close, his eyes never leaving her. "Ready?" Derek asked, his voice low and filled with something more than just professionalism. He knelt beside her, his hand resting on her abdomen to guide her through the next exercise. The pressure of his palm against her stomach sent a ripple of heat through her, and Olivia struggled to keep her breathing steady. She nodded, her throat dry as she lifted her legs, engaging her core. Derek's hand remained on her, his fingers splayed across her skin, and the heat from his touch seemed to seep into her very bones. His proximity was overwhelming, and for a moment, Olivia forgot where she was, her mind clouded with thoughts she couldn't quite suppress. But then, Jamal moved closer, kneeling on her other side, his presence grounding her once again. His hand reached out, brushing against her arm as he spoke. "Keep your form tight," he said softly, his voice like a balm against the tension that had been building. Their combined presence was intoxicating, and Olivia felt like she was teetering on the edge of something she couldn't quite define. The air around them felt charged, heavy with unspoken words and unfulfilled desires. She could feel the weight of their attention on her. the way their gazes lingered on her body as she moved, as she followed their instructions. When the session finally ended, Olivia was left breathless. Not just from the physical exertion, but from the intensity of the connection that had developed between the three of them. She lay on the mat for a moment, her chest rising and falling as she tried to catch her breath, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite process. "Good job today," Derek said, his voice soft but filled with meaning. His hand lingered on her shoulder for a moment longer than necessary before he stood, offering her a hand to help her up. Jamal remained quiet, but his eyes were on her, watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. There was something unspoken between them, something that had been simmering for weeks, but had finally come to the surface. As Olivia stood, her body still trembling from the workout, she realized that the dynamic between them had changed. This wasn't just about physical attraction anymore. It was something deeper, something more complicated, and she wasn't sure what that meant for the future. But she knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening between her, Derek, and Jamal, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Later that evening, as Olivia lay in bed, her mind replayed every moment of the session. She couldn't shake the feeling of their hands on her, the way their touches had lingered, the way their gazes had burned into her skin. The tension between the three of them had reached a breaking point, and Olivia knew it was only a matter of time before something gave. She rolled onto her back, staring up at the ceiling as the events of the day played out in her mind. Derek's intensity, Jamal's quiet strength, it was all too much, too overwhelming. And yet, she couldn't deny the thrill that came with it. The way her heart raced every time she thought of them. The way her body responded to their presence. There was no escaping it now. The connection between them had deepened, and there was no turning back. Olivia knew that the next time she saw them, everything would be different. The boundaries between them had blurred, and she wasn't sure where it would lead. But she was certain that it would change everything. By the time Olivia arrived for the next session, the air felt thicker than usual. The gym was quieter than she had ever seen it. A few people were scattered throughout, but the usual buzz of activity was missing. The sunlight that filtered through the large windows felt muted, casting long, soft shadows over the weight racks and machines. The tension in Olivia's chest mirrored the stillness of the room as she walked toward Derek and Jamal. She could feel the charged energy between the three of them, as though something invisible had been building for weeks and was now ready to burst. Derek was already by the free weights, his gaze lingering on her as she approached. There was no playful banter this time, no teasing smile. Instead, his eyes were dark, focused, and filled with something unspoken, a weight Olivia could feel even before he said a word. Jamal stood nearby, his usual calm demeanor masking something deeper. There was an intensity to him today that she hadn't noticed before, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. "Let's start," Derek said simply, his voice carrying a low edge that sent a shiver down Olivia's spine. They began with a light warm-up, but Olivia's mind was elsewhere. Every glance, every brush of their hands seemed to carry a different meaning now, one that was impossible to ignore. She was hyper-aware of their proximity, of the way Derek's fingers grazed her waist as he helped her with her form, of the way Jamal's quiet gaze never left her as he handed her the weights. As they moved through the exercises, Olivia felt the tension between them coil tighter with each passing minute. Derek's touch lingered longer than usual, his hands firm on her hips as he guided her through a squat, his voice low and filled with something more than just instruction. Jamal, though quieter, seemed equally intense, his eyes locking onto hers every time they made contact, as though silently communicating something she couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't long before the workout took a different turn. Derek had her move to the mats for a series of stretches, his hands on her the entire time. He was closer now, his breath hot against her neck as he adjusted her position. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest, each touch sending a ripple of heat through her. She could feel the tension building, the air between them crackling with unspoken desire. But it was Jamal who finally broke the silence. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cutting through the charged air. He stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with something Olivia hadn't seen before. A mix of vulnerability and certainty. Olivia looked between the two of them, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel it now, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just about the workout anymore. Something had shifted, and it was too late to turn back. Derek's hand tightened slightly on her waist, as if he wasn't quite ready to let go. "Yeah, we do," he agreed, his voice low, almost a growl. They guided her toward a quieter corner of the gym, away from prying eyes. Olivia's pulse raced, her skin tingling with anticipation and confusion. She knew what was coming, but that didn't make it any easier to process. The silence between them was deafening as they finally stopped, the weight of the moment settling over them like a heavy blanket. "I think we've all felt it," Jamal said, his voice calm but firm. His eyes met Olivia's, and she could see the depth of his emotions there, the vulnerability he had been holding back. "This tension, it's not just in our heads." Derek nodded, his expression unreadable, but his body language revealing more than his words. He took a step closer to Olivia, his hand brushing against hers. "We've crossed a line," he said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of desire and restraint. "And we can't pretend it hasn't happened." Olivia swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had felt it too, this pull between the three of them, this connection that had grown stronger with each session. But hearing them say it out loud, acknowledging what had been simmering beneath the surface for so long, made it feel real in a way she hadn't expected. "So what now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air around them felt thick with possibility, with the weight of their emotions and the unspoken desires that had been building for weeks. Then, slowly, Jamal reached out, his fingers brushing against Olivia's cheek. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, and Olivia felt her breath hitch in her throat. "We see where this takes us," Jamal said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. Derek stepped closer too, his hand resting on Olivia's waist once more. The warmth of his touch seeped into her skin, and Olivia felt her heart race in response. "If you want this, if you want us," he said, his voice low and filled with promise, "then we're here. No more games, no more pretending." Olivia's mind spun with the weight of their words, but her body responded before she could fully process what was happening. She leaned into Derek's touch, her heart hammering in her chest as she felt the tension between them finally begin to break. Jamal's hand slid from her cheek to her neck, his touch soft but insistent, and Olivia felt herself being pulled into their gravity. The three of them stood there for what felt like an eternity, caught in the moment, the connection between them deepening with every passing second. The gym around them seemed to fade into the background, leaving just the three of them, bound together by the intensity of their emotions and the unspoken understanding that this was something they couldn't walk away from. And then, slowly, almost hesitantly, Olivia closed the distance between them. Derek's breath hitched as her hand found his chest, and Jamal's eyes darkened as her fingers grazed his arm. The air between them crackled with electricity, the tension that had been building for weeks finally coming to a head. Their connection was undeniable now, and there was no turning back. In that moment, Olivia knew she wanted them both. She wanted everything they had to offer, the intensity, the passion, the fire that burned between them. Derek's lips found hers first, his kiss fierce and demanding, and Olivia melted into him, her body responding to his touch with an urgency she hadn't realized was there. But before she could lose herself completely, Jamal's hand was on her waist, pulling her back, grounding her with his calm, steady presence. His lips were softer, more patient, but no less intense. Olivia felt herself being consumed by the two of them, their touches, their kisses, the way they moved together as if they were all part of the same rhythm. The gym, once a place of routine and structure, had become something entirely different. A space where they could explore this new dynamic, where they could let go of the boundaries that had once held them back. By the time the moment finally passed, Olivia was left breathless, her skin tingling from the intensity of their connection. She looked between Derek and Jamal, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to catch her breath. They stood close, their expressions filled with the same mixture of desire and uncertainty that she felt coursing through her veins. "This isn't over," Derek said softly, his voice laced with promise. "Not by a long shot." Jamal nodded, his eyes still locked onto Olivia's. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly, his hand brushing against hers. "Together." Olivia smiled, her heart swelling with the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together. The boundaries between them had blurred, but that was okay. They would navigate this new territory, this connection that had grown stronger with each passing day. And no matter what, they would be there for each other. As Olivia left the gym that day, the weight of what had happened settled over her like a warm blanket. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. The connection between her, Derek, and Jamal had changed everything, and she was ready to see where it would take them.